I almost didn't stop for it. When you have been living outside long enough, you develop a specific relationship with things that are attached to surfaces, notices, warnings, eviction orders, shelter capacity announcements. You learn to read them from a distance with the practiced eye of someone who has been surprised by official language often enough to want early warning. You learn which ones require your attention and which ones are for other people and which ones, specifically, are the kind that tell you the space you have been sleeping in is no longer available to you. The envelope nailed to the oak tree on the eastern edge of Caldwell Park was different from any of those. I knew that from 20 feet away, though I could not have explained the knowing. It was the quality of the paper, maybe, cream-colored, thick, the kind of envelope that communicated before it was opened that whatever was inside it had been prepared with deliberate care. Or it was the placement, eye level, centered on the tree's flattest section of bark, nailed with a single brass tack rather than stapled or taped. The way you hang something you intend to be found, not the way you post a notice you intend to be complied with. My name was on the front. Not my full name. Just Lena. But my name is not common, and there was nobody else in Caldwell Park that Tuesday morning in November, and the handwriting, a precise, unhurried cursive that took its time with every letter, had the quality of something written by someone who had known exactly who they were writing to. I was 20 years old. I had been sleeping in Caldwell Park for 11 days, in the northeast corner where the maintenance shed blocked the wind. After the room I had rented week to week above a laundromat on Prescott Street was claimed by a landlord who had sold the building with 48 hours notice and a legal right to do so. I took the envelope off the tree. I opened it. The first document was a deed. The second was a letter that began, "You don't know me, Lena. But I have known about you for 21 years, and what I have done with that knowledge is either the greatest mistake or the greatest gift of my life. I am hoping, now that I am out of time to correct it, that it was the gift." I stood at the base of the oak tree in Caldwell Park, in the November cold, and I read every word. And my life, the life I had been barely holding together on the outside of everything, became something unrecognizable. I was not born into homelessness. I want to say that clearly, not as a defense but as context, because the path from a beginning to where I ended up is the part that matters. And it is more common than most people who have not walked it would like to believe. My name is Lena Vassar. I grew up in Delwood, Ohio, a suburb that existed in the specific register of places that are neither affluent enough to be comfortable nor distressed enough to access the systems designed for distress. My mother, Diane, worked as a medical billing coder for a hospital group. She was precise, private, and functioned with the compressed efficiency of a person who has learned to do everything herself because depending on anyone else has proven unreliable. She raised me alone, which she did without complaint and without, I think, ever fully letting me see the cost. I was a good student in the way that students who have learned that performance is protection are good, thorough, compliant, capable of producing what was asked without necessarily understanding why it was being asked. I had friends in the way that children who move through their environments carefully have friends, close enough for comfort, distant enough to maintain. I was observant. I was quiet in groups and articulate alone, which is a combination that adults called mature and peers occasionally called strange. What I was, I understand now, was a girl who had learned very early that visibility was a risk and invisibility was a strategy. And who had applied that lesson so consistently that by 17 I was genuinely uncertain who I was when nobody was watching. My mother died during my first semester at community college. Cervical cancer, which she had known about for 14 months before she told me, 14 months of managing her illness privately. Protecting me from the knowledge with the same efficiency she applied to everything else, right up until the point where the protection was no longer feasible. She died in October. I was 18. I withdrew from school to manage the estate, which took 3 months and produced almost nothing, a modest life insurance policy that covered her medical debt and the cost of the funeral and left me with $3,000 and the understanding that the apartment we had shared was leased in her name and not mine. I was out of the apartment by January. I spent a year couch surfing, a word that makes the experience sound more comfortable than it is. What it actually involves is the constant management of other people's patience, the calculation of exactly how long any given welcome will last. The performance of gratitude that is genuine but also tactical, and the particular exhaustion of never setting anything down fully because setting things down implies a permanence that does not exist. By my 20th year, I had exhausted the network and was sleeping in Caldwell Park. I was not hopeless. I want to be precise about that. I was tired and cold and operating on the compressed logic of immediate survival, but I had not stopped thinking about the future. I had a public library card. I spent my days there, reading, applying for work, attending the job skills program that the branch offered on Tuesday afternoons. I had a prepaid phone with limited data that I protected the way some people protect irreplaceable objects. I was still trying. The morning I found the envelope. I had been in the library the previous afternoon researching transitional housing programs in the county and had returned to the park at dusk to eat the food I had gotten from the church pantry on Mercer Street and sleep in the maintenance shed corner. I woke before sunrise. Walked the park perimeter, which was a habit I had developed, knowing the geography of the space you occupy is basic safety, and saw the envelope on the oak tree in the grey early light. Something was already shifting before I touched it. Some interior register that I had learned to trust, the one that had kept me mostly safe for 11 months, telling me this was different. It was. The deed was for a property called Harwick Hall. The name was printed at the top of the first page in the formal language of real property law, the full legal description, the county assessor's identification number. The address on 17 acres of land outside Harwick Township in Caldwell County, Ohio. The deed of transfer named the grantor as the estate of Edmund Harwick III, and the grantee as Lena Marie Vassar. My full name. Spelled correctly. I turned to the letter. Edmund Harwick III had been, I would learn through the letter and then through a great deal of subsequent research, the last surviving member of the Harwick family, a family whose money was old enough that it had ceased to be about any specific industry and had become simply a condition. The way weather is a condition, present without requiring explanation. Real estate, regional banking interests, a timber portfolio that spanned 4 counties, art holdings, bonds. The Harwick estate was the kind of wealth that is tended rather than built. Maintained by accountants and attorneys and the accumulated institutional knowledge of generations of professional management. Edmund had died 6 weeks before I found the envelope. He was 79. He had no children. His wife had died 14 years earlier. His siblings had predeceased him. The estate, without a direct heir, had been the subject of considerable legal and institutional speculation for the final years of his life. The letter was 8 pages. Edmund wrote with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life in the company of lawyers and had learned their respect for exact language without adopting their coldness. He wrote that he had known about me since before I was born. That my mother, Diane Vassar, had worked for a Harwick-affiliated company in her early 20s, a medical records firm in Columbus that handled billing for several hospital groups including one in which the Harwick family held a minority interest. That during that time, Diane had encountered information about the Harwick family's medical and financial history in the course of her work. That Edmund's brother, Charles Harwick, who had died in a car accident in 2002, was my biological father. I sat down on the park bench nearest the oak tree. My biological father had a name. I continued reading. Charles Harwick had known about the pregnancy. He and Diane had made, according to Edmund's account, a mutual decision, though Edmund acknowledged with what read like genuine discomfort that the decision may not have been as mutual as Charles had characterized it. Charles had provided financial support for the first 2 years of my life through a private arrangement that Diane had agreed to in exchange for discretion. Then Charles had died, and the arrangement had ended with him, and Diane had continued alone. Edmund had known all of this. He had tracked my existence, not intrusively, he wrote, but consistently. Annual checks through private means to confirm I was alive and located. He had watched my mother die through his monitoring and had felt, he wrote, a shame that arrived too late to be useful and a guilt that I have carried every day since. He had intended to come forward earlier. He had always found a reason to wait. Then his own health had deteriorated, and the reason to wait had become the absence of time, and he had done the only thing available to a man who has run out of time. He had acted with what remained. He had named me sole heir of the Harwick estate. The estate, his letter noted with the understatement of a man accustomed to large numbers, was valued at approximately $410 million in current assessments. He had placed the deed and letter in the envelope himself. He had asked his estate attorney, a man named Philip Strand in Columbus, to have the envelope delivered and affixed to the oak tree in Caldwell Park at the specific coordinates he provided, coordinates he had, Edmund wrote, identified through the monitoring he described. He had known I was sleeping in the park. He had known the oak tree was the one I pass most mornings. He had made sure I would find it. He ended the letter with one sentence that I read 7 times before I moved: I cannot give you back what you were owed. I can only give you what remains and ask you, without any right to ask anything, to build something with it that is yours. I sat on the bench until the park filled with mourning people. Dog walkers. Joggers. A woman with a stroller who glanced at me and away with the practiced non-acknowledgement of someone who has learned to move through public space without making contact. None of them knew that the girl on the bench with a backpack and yesterday's clothes was holding a deed to $410 million. I called Philip Strand at 9 o'clock when business hours began. He answered on the first ring. "Ms. Vassar," he said. "I've been expecting your call." Philip Strand arranged for a car. Not a taxi, a car, with a driver, which arrived at the Caldwell Park North entrance at 10:30 and idled there while I stood on the sidewalk with my backpack and looked at it. The driver was a man of about 60 named Gerald who did not react to my appearance with any visible register of judgment, which I noticed and appreciated. He held the door. I got in. The drive to Harwick Hall was 40 minutes. I spent them in the back seat with the letter and the deed on my lap, reading both again with the attention I had not been able to give them in the cold and shock of initial discovery. The second reading was different from the first, not in content but in the quality of my reception. The first reading had been pure data, absorbed too fast for processing. The second reading was slower, and the slowness allowed the emotional content to arrive. I felt it in layers. The first layer was grief. For my mother, for what she had carried alone, for the 14 months she had known about her illness and chosen to protect me from it. And for the 17 years before that when she had known about Charles Harwick and chosen to protect me from that too. And for the specific exhaustion of a woman who protects everyone around her and no one protects her back. My mother had not been weak. She had been the opposite of weak. But there is a kind of strength that is indistinguishable from loneliness, and sitting in the back of that car, I understood for the first time the full weight of what she had carried. The second layer was anger. Not the hot, immediate kind, the cold, considered kind that arrives when you have had time to understand the shape of what was done and what was not done. Edmund Harwick had known. He had known since before I was born. He had watched my mother work herself through an abbreviated life and die without adequate care while he managed a $400 million estate with professional attention. He had found reasons to wait, year after year, while I slept in a park. The third layer was something harder to name. Not gratitude, exactly. Not forgiveness, too early for that. Something more like the particular alertness of someone who has been handed an enormous responsibility and understands, in their bones, that they are being asked to be larger than the circumstances that have shaped them. The car turned off the county road onto a private drive. Harwick Hall emerged from a canopy of mature oaks and elms that had been planted, I would later learn, by Edmund's grandfather in 1919. The house was federal style, 3 stories of red brick with white trim, symmetrical, composed. The kind of architecture that communicates order and permanence through proportion rather than ornament. It sat at the end of a 300-foot approach flanked by the trees, and in the November light, stripped of leaves. The trees created a colonnade effect that was completely unintentional and entirely beautiful. I pressed my face slightly toward the window and looked. I had never been in a building like this. I grew up in apartments and rented houses and the institutional spaces of libraries and community centers and, most recently, a park. I had studied buildings in the way that someone who cannot afford to travel studies maps, with the understanding that knowledge and access are different things. This was access. Gerald opened my door. Philip Strand was waiting at the front entrance, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the careful manner of an attorney who has handled significant estates long enough to have developed a personal philosophy about wealth and its complications. He shook my hand. He looked at me with the specific directness of someone who is looking at the thing itself rather than its circumstances. "Welcome to Harwick Hall, Miss Vassar," he said. "It's yours." I walked through the door. The smell of the interior, old wood, stone, the particular quality of air in rooms that have been carefully maintained for generations, hit me with a force that was almost physical. Not overwhelming. Clarifying. The way certain environments reduce you to the precise size of yourself, without inflation or diminishment. I was here. Whatever came next, I was here. Philip gave me a tour that first day that lasted 3 hours. 17 acres of grounds. The main house, 22 rooms across 3 floors, plus a basement and attic. A separate carriage house converted to a 4-bay garage. A greenhouse that had been maintained through the estate's horticultural staff. A formal garden on the south side, dormant in November, and beyond it a kitchen garden that had been producing food for the Harwick household for 60 years. Inside the main house, rooms that were beautiful in the specific way of things that have been cared for across generations. Original floors, rugs of real quality, furniture that was old enough to be significant and maintained well enough to still be functional. Art on the walls, not decorative but substantial, the collected taste of 4 generations of people who had bought what they genuinely found worth looking at. Philip walked me through all of it. He was thorough and informative and not sycophantic, which I appreciated. He answered every question I had with the specificity of someone who had been managing this estate long enough to know it completely. At the end of the tour, I asked him about the room. I had noticed it on the 2nd floor, a door at the end of the east corridor that was slightly different from the others. The other doors had their hardware polished, their hinges maintained, the quality of routine care. This door had been cleaned recently. I could see the slightly brighter zone where dust had been wiped from the surface, but the cleaning had the quality of preparation rather than maintenance. As if the room behind it had been prepared for this specific day. Philip paused. "Edmund asked that you see that room on your own," he said. He was specific about it. He left instructions that it was to remain locked until you arrived, and that you should have the key and time alone in it before anything else was discussed. He gave me a key. Brass, old, with a bow that had been worn smooth. I went to the room alone. The lock released without resistance. The room was a study. Smaller than I expected from the corridor's dimensions, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, with a single north-facing window that looked out at the elm tree canopy. The window's light was the soft, even light of an overcast November afternoon, which filled the room without shadows. The desk was central. A writing desk, antique, with a leather surface worn to the patina of long use. On the desk, a series of objects arranged with the deliberateness of someone setting a table. A photograph album, closed, with a slip of paper on the cover marked "Begin Here." A small wooden box, sealed with a simple clasp. A stack of envelopes, banded together, each one numbered in sequence. A framed photograph, face down. I sat in the chair at the desk, the chair of a man I had never met, positioned at the desk where he had presumably spent a significant portion of his life, and I picked up the album. The first photograph was of a woman I didn't recognize, young, perhaps 22, in the clothes of the early 1990s. Laughing at whoever was behind the camera with the unguarded quality of someone who does not know they are being photographed. Below the photograph, in Edmund's handwriting on the album's page, Diane Vassar, Columbus, 1993. Charles took this. He kept the print. I found it after he died. My mother. 22 years old. Laughing the way I had rarely seen her laugh, without reserve. Without the slight guardedness that exhaustion and single parenthood produce in the laughter of people who have learned to be careful with their joy. I looked at that photograph for a long time. The album continued, more photographs of my mother, clearly candid and clearly taken without full awareness, spanning 2 years. Then photographs that were not of her, photographs of a man I understood. From Edmund's caption on the first one was Charles Harwick. Handsome in an uncontrived way, smiling in the specific manner of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting. My biological father. He looked nothing like me. But then, on the 6th page, there was a photograph that made me stop breathing for a moment. A photograph of a small girl, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, sitting in a park I recognized by its layout as Caldwell Park, feeding birds from her palm. With the complete absorbed focus of a toddler who has found something entirely engaging. Me. Someone had photographed me in Caldwell Park when I was 2 or 3 years old. The caption in Edmund's handwriting, Lena, 1996. Private photograph, obtained through arranged observation. Charles had asked for documentation before the accident. I continued it after. Edmund had been documenting my existence since I was a toddler. The photographs in the album span 20 years. Candid, all of them. School events, visible from a distance. A cross-country meet, I had run cross-country at Delwood High, which I had not known anyone outside my school had witnessed. My mother's funeral, taken from the back of the church, showing me at 18 in a borrowed black coat. And then, the last photograph in the album. Caldwell Park, 11 days ago. A long lens image of a girl with a backpack and dark hair, asleep in the corner near the maintenance shed, with the November morning light just beginning to clarify the scene. Me. Sleeping. 11 days ago. Edmund had known exactly where I was. He had arranged the envelope. He had arranged Gerald and the car. He had arranged this room and the album and the desk. He had been watching me for 20 years and had arranged everything except the earlier intervention. The wooden box held a letter. This letter was different from the one in the envelope, shorter, more personal, written in a hand that was less steady, the hand of a sick man near the end of his time. I know what the album shows, he wrote. I know how it will feel to look at it. I am not asking you to forgive observation that was not consented to, or inaction that cannot be justified. I am asking you only to understand that what you are looking at is 20 years of a man who loved the idea of doing right and was not brave enough to actually do it until there was nothing left to lose. I watched you grow up. I watched your mother work. I watched and did not intervene, and I have no defense that is worth offering. The estate is yours. Not as compensation, nothing compensates for what was withheld. But as the most honest thing I could do with what remained of my time. The framed photograph on the desk is the last thing I want you to see. I reached for the photograph that had been placed face down. I turned it over. It was a portrait. A formal one, painted rather than photographed, the kind of portrait that sits in drawing rooms of old houses and stares across generations. A woman in the clothes of the 1940s, with dark hair and the particular quality of stillness in painted faces that makes them seem about to speak. The woman in the portrait looked like me. Not like me the way a relative can look like you, like me the way a mirror looks like you. The jaw. The eye placement. The specific shape of the hairline. The nameplate on the bottom of the frame, Eleanor Vassar Harwick, 1947. I looked at Philip Strand's business card on the desk. I picked up my phone. Philip came to the study within 5 minutes. He saw the portrait and he saw my face, and he had the grace to sit down in the chair across the desk without waiting to be asked. "Who is Eleanor Vassar Harwick?" I said. Philip's expression was not surprised. It was the expression of a man who has been holding a specific answer for a specific question and has finally been asked. Edmund's grandmother, he said. She married Arthur Harwick in 1944. She was born Eleanor Vassar in Delwood, Ohio. The room was very quiet. "Vassar," I said. "Yes. That's my mother's name." "My mother's family name." "Yes," Philip said. "And it was not a coincidence that Charles Harwick met your mother through a company with Harwick connections." Edmund believed, I should say Edmund knew, he had the genealogical research to confirm it, that your mother was Eleanor's great-grandniece. A distant connection. A branch of the Vassar family that had moved to Columbus in the 1960s. I understood what he was telling me, but I needed him to say it clearly. My mother was already connected to the Harwick family before she met Charles. Distantly. Very distantly, the blood connection was for generations removed, legally and practically insignificant. But Edmund found it significant in a personal sense. He felt it explained something he had always found difficult to articulate about your mother, and later about you. Philip paused. He said it was as if the family had been trying to come back to itself. I looked at the portrait. Eleanor Vassar Harwick, 1947. My great-great something. A woman who had married into this family and whose face I was apparently wearing 80 years later, having arrived at this house through a path that nobody had designed but that had a terrible, elegant logic when you laid it flat and looked at it. But that was not the twist that mattered most. Philip reached into the document folder he had brought and placed a single page on the desk. Edmund left this with his final instructions, he said. He asked that it be shown to you after you had seen the album and the portrait. He believed the context was necessary for you to receive it correctly. I read it. It was a legal summary. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph described a trust, not the main estate trust, a separate one, established in 1995 by Edmund Harwick III on behalf of a minor child identified by initials only, LMV. My initials. The trust had been funded in 1995, the year I was born, with an initial contribution of $200,000. Edmund had been contributing to it since, annually, consistently, for 20 years. The trust had an appointed trustee with instructions to release the funds to LMV upon her 21st birthday, at which point she would need to appear in person at the trustee's office to claim it. My 21st birthday was in 4 months. I had been 4 months away from being found regardless. The second paragraph was harder to read. It stated that the trustee, an attorney in Columbus named Margaret Chen, separate from Philip Strand's firm, had attempted to contact Lena Marie Vassar at her last known address in Delwood, Ohio. 6 months prior to her 21st birthday, as per the trust's protocol. The letter had been sent to the Delwood apartment that had been my mother's address, the address on file, the address that had been accurate until my mother's death. The letter had been returned undeliverable. Margaret Chen had then attempted to locate me through standard skip tracing methods. She had been unable to find a current address. She had reported the inability to Edmund. Edmund, who was already ill, who had already known through his own monitoring that I was sleeping in Caldwell Park, had received this report and had understood something that the document in my hands made explicit in Edmund's own handwritten note at the bottom of the page. If Margaret's letter had reached Lena 6 months ago, she would have had access to the trust funds, $600,000 as of that date, and would not have been sleeping in the park when I died. The trust was always supposed to find her. It failed to find her. The envelope on the tree was my correction of a system that should not have required correction. I am sorry it took this long. $600,000. Edmund had established a trust for me at my birth. He had been funding it for 20 years. He had done this, had kept this quiet, separate, unconnected to the main estate question, while also doing nothing about the larger situation, the larger failing. He had found a middle ground between acting and not acting and had occupied it for 2 decades. And that middle ground, the trust that was supposed to find me and didn't, was the thing that had put me in the park. I sat with that arithmetic for a long time. If the letter had been deliverable, if Margaret Chen's letter had reached me at the Delwood address while I was still couch surfing through the network, which I had been for 6 months after losing my mother's apartment, I would have had $600,000 at 21 and the park would never have happened. Edmund had set up a system to help me. The system had failed. And he had spent his last weeks building the envelope on the tree as a manual override. I put the document down. I looked at the portrait of Eleanor Vassar Harwick. I thought about my mother, who had known about the Harwick money and had chosen discretion, who had struggled and worked and managed alone. who had known she was dying and had still not reached out to the Harwicks for help because the deal she had made with Charles had been a deal and she was a woman who kept her word even when the word cost her everything. I thought about Edmund, watching from a distance, funding a trust he believed would automatically reach me, discovering too late that it hadn't, doing the only thing he could still do. I thought about Eleanor, whose face I was wearing, who had married into this family in 1944 and whose bloodline, separated. Living at distance for 3 generations, had found its way back through the specific accident of Charles Harwick meeting Diane Vassar in Columbus in 1993. None of them had designed it. All of them had participated in it. And I was the result. I was the result, sitting at Edmund's desk, in November light, holding a deed to everything that remained. The legal process took 8 months. 8 months of meetings with Philip Strand and his team, with Margaret Chen who cried when I walked into her office and apologized 11 times for the undeliverable letter. With accountants and estate managers and the institutional machinery that surrounds significant wealth with the density of a physical environment. 8 months of learning about the estate, its holdings, its history, its obligations, the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. The community relationships it had maintained and those it had neglected. I moved into Harwick Hall at Philip's recommendation, not because I had decided to keep it, but because the estate required active management and the most efficient manager was the one with legal authority and physical presence. I moved in with my backpack and the photograph of my mother from the album, which Philip had released to me on the first day as personal property, and I put the photograph on the desk in the study. I lived in those rooms with the awareness of impermanence, the way I had learned to live everywhere. Setting things down carefully but not finally, understanding that the decision about what this place would become was not yet made. The decision took for months to make. What helped me make it was people. The estate employed 14 people directly, groundskeepers, the house manager, the horticultural staff, the maintenance team. They had worked for the Harwick estate for years, in some cases decades. They were practical, knowledgeable, respectful without being deferential, and they taught me things about the property and its management that no document could have communicated. I worked alongside them, not to perform accessibility, but because I needed to understand what I was responsible for, and you cannot understand a thing from a distance. I learned the greenhouse from the horticultural manager, a woman named Rosa who had grown food for the Harwick household for 18 years and who showed me, without being asked, what the kitchen garden could produce if expanded and what the county food bank received from its current output. I learned the grounds from a man named Victor who had maintained them for 22 years and who had ideas, specific, practical, clearly long-considered ideas, about the eastern acreage that had been left fallow for a decade. I learned the house from Margaret, the house manager, who had the complete institutional memory of a person who has been paying attention for a long time in a specific place. I listened to all of them. Then I called a meeting. 14 people around the long table in the dining room that had been used for formal Harwick dinners for 100 years. I had never convened anything. I was 20 years old and had been sleeping in a park 8 months earlier, and these were people with decades of knowledge about a property I had owned for less than a year. I was honest about all of that. I told them what I knew about Edmund's intentions. I told them what I intended, to keep the estate operating, to expand the kitchen garden's food bank contribution, to open the eastern acreage to a community agricultural program that Victor had outlined in a proposal I had asked him to write, to create a trust, separate from the estate, structured carefully with Philip's help, that would fund transitional housing in Caldwell County, specifically for young people aging out of systems without adequate support. To name it the Diane Vassar Foundation. The room was quiet when I finished. Victor said, "We've been waiting for someone to actually ask what we thought." I said, "I'm asking." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. I went back to Caldwell Park on a Tuesday in July, 8 months after the envelope on the tree. I walked the perimeter the way I had walked it every morning for 11 days. Past the maintenance shed. Past the oak tree, which had its summer leaves back, full and green, the brass tacks still faintly visible in the bark where Philip's courier had removed the envelope. I sat on the bench where I had first read Edmund's letter. The morning was warm. People were moving through the park with the ease of summer, joggers, families, a group of teenagers on the grass with a speaker playing something I didn't recognize. None of them knew that the woman on the bench had once slept in this park's northeast corner. None of them knew about the envelope or the deed or the portrait or the 8 months of meetings that had followed. I didn't need them to know. I needed to be here. To sit in this specific place and feel the full distance between that November morning and this July 1, and understand that the distance was not only about money or property or legal process. The distance was about what I had decided to do with the weight of what I had been given. I had decided to make it useful. That was the whole of the answer. I got up from the bench. I had a meeting with the transitional housing architect at 10. I walked out of the park into the summer morning. The portrait of Eleanor Vassar Harwick still hangs in the study. I see it every morning when I sit at the desk. I have become accustomed to it in the way you become accustomed to a face that is also your own, not comfortably, exactly, but with a recognition that has settled into something like conversation. I look at her and I think about the specific chances that had to align for me to be sitting in that room. The meeting in Columbus in 1993. The accident in 2002. The undeliverable letter. The envelope on the tree. None of it was designed. All of it happened. My mother used to say, in the practical way that she said most things, you work with what you have, Lena. You don't wait for what you don't. She said it when the car broke down. She said it when the heating bill exceeded the budget. She said it when her diagnosis made the future a narrower corridor than it had been. She said it, I now understand, because she had been applying it to the Harwick situation for 20 years, working with what she had, which was herself. Rather than reaching for what she had agreed not to reach for. I am trying to do both things simultaneously, work with what I have and build toward what is possible for people who don't have it yet. The Diane Vassar Foundation opened its first transitional housing facility in April. 12 units. A waiting list by the end of the first month. Somewhere in that facility is a person who was sleeping in a park 2 weeks ago. I know exactly what that feels like. I know what it takes to keep trying from the outside of everything, when the inside seems sealed against you. I also know that sealed things can be opened. Sometimes all it takes is someone nailing an envelope to a tree. Build what you can. Leave what you build for whoever needs it next. That is the only inheritance that matters.